Hello, everyone. So let me introduce you Vinícius Venâncio, who is a PhD, who holds a PhD and a master's degree in social anthropology from the University of Brasilia, the very center of Brazil. He's currently undertaking a postdoc fellowship at the Institute of African Studies at the University of Leipzig. And since 2016, he has conducted research in Cape Verde, a little bit sunnier than Leipzig, where he now is. And he's analyzing topics of migration, tourism flows, national identities, and material culture, and how these intersect. He's the author of a book, O Comércio da Saudade, so the commerce of health, tourism, and the production of genuinely Cape Verdean souvenirs on the island of Santiago. Now, I'm going to let Vinicius introduce his exciting research, but before I'll take 5 minutes of your time and I'll annoyingly try to set this up within our own framework so we can make sense of this very, very rich material which we are about to listen to. So I'm going to start the introduction by stating the obvious. Southeastern Europe is this balkanized space, a fragmented kaleidoscope of identities, divisions. But there is method in my madness in presenting this, our context as such, because I want to set up a broader plan of action, one that goes beyond our context and sets up these solidarities across different locales in the world. So some of the broad simplifications about Southeastern Europe and how I want you to think of the sort of conversations we're about to hear from Vinicius is we often think of the identitarian and power struggles in our region, in Southeastern Europe, in relation to being the backwater of Europe. And we are structurally and historically caught in this gradient, I would say, in this continuum, caught between the aspirational Europeanness and the Orient and many other gradients. We are caught between the legacy of foreign imperial projects, but we also benefit from the West, which acquired much of its hegemonic position in the world through colonialism and exploitation of the global South. So we're all part of this interconnected web. Furthermore, when it comes to the actual everyday experiences, we are part of this patchwork of fragmented integration of the Balkans becoming part of the EU, at the same time experiencing this consistent contact with the global South. In the past, this was mainly through student exchanges funneled by the non-aligned movement, but then, and I'm simplifying, of course, since 2015, we've been confronted with thousands of people fleeing political upheavals in the Middle East, going towards Western Europe, and now we're experiencing this fairly unprecedented influx of foreign workers from the global South. And both groups, even though they're labeled as temporary by their administrative designation or the way in which we symbolically frame them, are often here to stay. And these processes of exchange are happening on top of existing ethnic, linguistic, religious complexity. And so really, I like to think of this area as at the crossroads of a dense matrix of class, ethnic, racial, and migration gradients. And we're all sharing this space. So what do I want to do here? I want to contribute in the conversation, in understanding our own space by engaging with other locales that share a lot of these power structures. And this is where I bring Vinicius in, and he's agreed, I'm so very grateful, to lead us into this world that probably a lot of us are not acquainted with. So a Brazilian anthropologist, a race scholar, somebody who encourages the kind of dialogue I think we urgently need. One which in societal analysis from the global South inform the way we look at ourselves at the borderlands of Europe. And I hope this is just one among the many conversations in which we exchange knowledge, but also resistance strategies and theoretical frameworks between the post-colonial global South and the post-socialist, post-imperial, post-whatever you want to define us. We are many posts here, post-modern, Balkan space. So as you listen to Vinicius, I invite you to think about how the processes he describes resonate in your own context. How do the power and the group dynamics he outlines how might they inform the way you think of your own realities? And think as well too about language, which is often underestimated as this deeply embodied structure of power and identity. So without further ado, here is Vinicius.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to share my screen because I have this PowerPoint presentation, and I will take my notes because English is not my first language, so I'm sorry if my English is not that good. But let's go. First of all, I would like to thank Rene Bogović in the name of the Regional Network of Centers for Advanced Studies in Southeast Europe for inviting me to be here today and share some of my of the research I have been doing in Cape Verde for the last 10 years, as well as the audience present today. With this talk, my goal is to share with you some questions about the use of the language in Cape Verde and its regimes of autochthony, belonging, and exclusion. However, before bringing a set of ethnographic excerpts found at different times in my research, I will make a brief historical presentation to contextualize the country. Let me pass this. Okay, so the archipelago of Cape Verde, composed of 10 islands, is in the West African coast, really close to Senegal.
I think we've lost you. Vinicius,
Started
are you there?
colonizing. Sorry.
I think we lost you for a minute. Could you please just repeat what you just said? Thank you.
Okay, I think my connection is not the best. I'm sorry about that. The archipelago of Cape Verde is composed of 10 islands, and it's located in West African coast, close to Senegal, but almost in the middle of the Atlantic. And unlike other continental African countries, there was no human settlement when the Portuguese arrived and settled in 1460 and started colonizing the island. And with a strategic commercial position in the middle of the Atlantic, the islands soon became central in the construction of the transatlantic route for Black African enslaved people over the following centuries, especially the island of Santiago, where we can see Praia, Cape Verde's capital, and Cidade Velha. Cidade Velha was the first city, first colonial city in tropics, and this huge center for Atlantic slavery during the modern era. Thus, the country was consulted from colonial and racial violence, which subjugated Black African populations through trafficking. Due to the arid climate of the islands, scarcity of rainfall and fresh water, the plantation system, which would prevail in Brazil, for an example, did not thrive there. Although some islands, such as Santiago and Santo Antão, had some success in the cultivation of some fruits and tubers, and also animals. In that context of hierarchical and unequal interaction, Antonio Carreira, an important historian and ethnographer of Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau, pointed out that a Portuguese-based pidgin, it's this contact language that it's turned more easy to be spoken by different people, emerged in the ports of Ribeira Grande Santiago, where it is now Cidade Velha, the first colonial city in the tropics. Still in the 15th century, and the pidgin language would have circulated from there to the ports of Bolam and Cacheu in Guinea-Bissau, giving rise to the Creoles of both countries. We have a Creole-based uh, Creole Portuguese based in Cabo Verde and a Creole based Portuguese based in Guinea-Bissau. They have some similarities, but also some difference between them. Some scholars point out that the language is the result of the fusion between Portuguese and the Portuguese spoken in Portugal, and this difference is important, and I will talk about this soon, with several West African languages, such as Mandinga, Wolof, Fula, Balanta, and Manjaco. due to the slavery regime that occurred in the archipelago. Also, there was an addition of vocabulary from English, French, and Italian due to the passage of nationals of these countries through the ports of Cape Verde during the centuries 19 and 20 especially, or by the migratory process of Cape Verdeans to countries that have this language as official. One important thing about Cape Verde is that nowadays the country counts with something like 500,000 people living in the archipelago, and something between 1 million and 1.5 million Cape Verdeans and their descendants outside the archipelago. So it's a huge diaspora. And a good example of this later experience with the English, French, and Italian languages formatting the Cape Verdean Creole is the term caso bode. Caso bode, let me here. Caso bode is how come to designate in recent years small robbers committed at gunpoint, and caso bode was originally announced by the English expression cash or body, give your money or lose your life, and with the time it became caso bode. Currently spoken by little more than 500,000 inhabitants of Cape Verdean and by its diaspora, Cape Verdean Creole or Cape Verdean language, we can call it by both names, face some dilemmas. The first one is how only Portuguese is the official language in the country, despite Portuguese is not spoken by all Cape Verdeans. All Cape Verdeans can speak the Creole, but not all of them speak Portuguese. The second issue we have is its variety. And we can think this variety in several levels. We have the biggest variety that researchers tend to divide, not only researchers, but also Cape Verdeans tend to divide the Cape Verdean Creole into two large groups. Those ones spoken in the Windward Islands, and let me get back here. The Windward Islands, Santo Antão, São Vicente, Santa Luzia, São Nicolau, Sal and Boa Vista, and the Leeward Islands, Brava, Fogo, Santiago, and Maio. In turn, in the Windward Islands, one can perceive a difference between the Creole spoken in Santo Antão, São Vicente, and São Nicolau, and that of Sal and Boa Vista. As well as in the Leeward Islands, there is a difference in Santiago Creole to the other islands, Fogo, Brava, and Maio. Again, there are levels of difference within the island of Santiago. And Santiago carries half of Cape Verdean's population, so it's a big island. In Praia, the country's capital, the spoken Creole is closer to the lexical base of Portuguese compared to that spoken in the interior of the island, what we call Santiago Fora, where rural life is more present. All this process, combined with an internal dispute of the nation between São Vicente and Santiago, which I will address later, hinder the process of officializing the language. The ALUPEC. ALUPEC means, and I come back here, unified alphabet for the writing of Cape Verdean. And we have lots of fights because, especially between Santiago and São Vicente, spotting which one of the island is most important in the history of the country. But let's go. Even amid the internal difference of the Creoles spoken in Cape Verde, the Institute of Cultural Heritage of Cape Verde has, in recent years, been carrying out studies to transform the mother tongue into intangible cultural heritage of the country. So we have this process, and the great tension is precisely in how to do it without erasing or sidelining one or more varieties. And almost always they are trying to unify the writing of Cape Verdean or Cape Verdean Creole. They tend to look at the Santiago form because more people speak and write that form of Cape Verdean Creole. Linked to the diversity of Creole in the country itself, there are also tensions of diglossia that mark the daily lives of its inhabitants. While the Portuguese language is the only official language of the country used in schools, public offices, television, congress, and other official spaces, Creole is the mother tongue used at home and in people's daily lives. In fact, it's common for children from the lower classes to have difficulties in school learning process due to the lack of technical mastery of Portuguese, despite the recent efforts of the national government to introduce the teaching of the Cape Verdean language in basic education, but only in the final years, despite researchers and teachers saying how efficient it would be to if children were literate in Creole and then they learn Portuguese. This tension reflects the way the language has been seen in the country's history. During Portuguese colonialism in the archipelago, Crioulo has seen as a misrepresentation of Portuguese and something to be extirpated from everyday life. In other words, a black language offensive to white European ears. Thus, those who spoke good Portuguese, and we can think what good Portuguese is, in a context where Portuguese people living in continental Portugal weren't able to speak grammatically correct Portuguese during colonial times. So those who spoke good Portuguese in Cape Verde would have more chances to ascend socially, which happens until these days. Currently, although the use of Crioulo have been reframed and its presence is valued as a symbol of the nation, there is a substantive difference in the game of possibilities between those who speak good Portuguese and those who only handle Crioulo. Having made this quick sketch of the situation of Creole in the country today, I move on to the presentation of short ethnographic excerpts to think about how Creole is used on a daily basis as a form of production of belonging, autochthony, and exclusion of non-nationals. And now I go to scene one.
Uh, Vinicius,
Yeah,
thank you so much for introducing. I just want to reassure everyone who's listening that this is a very, very complex setting, and we'll have a time after we're done to ask for clarification. But I think something that I dare say everyone here in our area can relate to is to how this fragmentation of language and this politicization of language and how different standardization processes are always caught between these like larger power structures. So we spoken a little bit about your rich ethnography before. So I think now that we've like set down the structure of language, its fragmentation, its history, how does it map on other axes of difference? And I think Habitanti is, if I'm not wrong, an instance of class. But I'll let you.
yeah, thank you. So thinking about Habitante, during my first field research in the country in the winter of 2017, I headed to Mindelo, a port city located on the island of São Vicente, known for its self-proclamation as the cultural capital of the country. At that time, my intention was to understand the transnational trade networks woven by women who used to head their households, lived in Mindelo, and went to countries such as Brazil, United States, Portugal, Italy, France, and Senegal to buy products which would be resold in Mindelo. As a start point, I had the studies of Marcia Grassi, Tatiana Silva, and Andrea Lobo. Andrea Lobo was my supervisor for my entire career on the habitantes of the island of Santiago. Habitante is a term that, according to Grassi, means in Cape Verdean Crioulo to turn around to get by, and is used to indicate someone who is very skilled at convincing others. So it has this ambiguous connotation. The term habitant encompasses a heterogeneous group of experience, like occasional sellers who, depending on the context and need, displays products on the sidewalk of their homes to get extra money. Two, merchants who sell at fairs, markets, or even at a fixed point on the street, but do not travel to purchase the products for sale. Or three, women who make regular trips to other countries and who sell in the market, a local market, in their own establishments or third parties. Whenever I questioned the women of Mindelo for this term, they pretended to not understand what I was saying and said that they were not habitantes. Curiously, two of them, and both of them were born in the island of Santiago, said to me that habitante was more used and widespread in Praia, where, according to the ethnographies carried out there, it demonstrates a more positive character. Bia, one of those two women, said that, and I'm quoting her, this term was used in the past. It is old. It is used more in Praia, not here. I say trader, small porter. Those who sell on the street we call bendedeira. It's like someone who sells on things. It's because of Crioulo, which is different between the islands. Now, almost 20 years after this first research, or 10 years, sorry, and I think we can think more than a difference in Crioulo is used in this situation. There is an implicit difference between those who see themselves as habitantes. And after that, I carried researching in Praia and other cities in Santiago. And the term habitante is really used between women who sell stuff, not only on streets, but in stores and other places. Now, I think we can think how the use or better, not using habitante can be seen as a way to deny the use of the term in favor of Portuguese terminologies is to move away from the stigma of Africanity that Sampajudos, those born in Barlavento or outside Santiago Island in general, input to Badios. And Badios is a term designated to anyone who was born in Santiago, and that term refers to slavery, used to designate runaway slaves as vagrants. And in Portuguese, vagrants is vadios that became badio. In the national internal dispute, the inhabitants of the island of Santiago are seen by the others, and especially by people in São Vicente, as blacker, more African, and therefore carry a series of stereotypes and dehumanizing controlling images, as Patricia Hill Collins points out, such as illiterates, violent, and other things. In this sense, in the desire to access a tangible modernity through international travel and acquired goods, the traders of Mindelo move away from the term in Crioulo to produce a singularity in a world marked by the anti-black racism. By this, they position themselves in a higher place in internal hierarchies.
You know, Venancio, what I find really interesting is that here language is used to mark difference within a space that's already in between, the powers of avoiding Africanness and negotiating colonialism. It also makes me think of linguistic purism in the Balkans, where we often try to assert proximity to the West. And there is this tendency, for example, in Serbo-Croatian, there's a lot of loanwords from Turkish, and they try to be repressed because they are a mark of a proximity to a different world, and there is this aspirational. So it's really interesting. So that's why I would like you to introduce more. And we spoke about this, and I found it so fascinating about how language is also used as creating belonging, as marking somebody who is part of this family, of this Cape Verdean family. But as you've already showed us, I think this family is not quite equal as it looks at first. So how does language make you belong, and what does it make you belong to?
That's a perfect question because now we go to scene two, and this new scene happened when I was in Cape Verde in 2019, and I was carrying out my master research on the production of an authentic Cape Verdean handcraft. To produce that data, I followed a series of institutional events. Among them was a handcraft bazaar that took place in the city center of Assomada. And Assomada is a city in the core of Santiago Island. And among the activities scheduled for that day was a lecture by a Cape Verdean nutritionist on how to make good use of food. And after starting his speech in Portuguese to a mostly Cape Verdean audience, probably I was the only non-Cape Verdean person there, the nutritionist decided to change the linguistic register to Creole asking if all the people present were comfortable, and with the affirmatives, he said, "Se não tudo tapapia crioulo, não é tudo crioulo." In English, if we all speak Creole, we are all Creoles. And here we have something really important. In Cape Verde, Crioulo is not only how they name the language they speak in everyday interactions, but also how they call themselves. It's a synonym for Cape Verdean. Oh, and he did that in order to mitigate the difference between his Crioulo de dentro, or a Creole spoken in Praia, and the Crioulo de fora, the Creole spoken in Santiago hinterlands. And most of the women who were there used to speak only Crioulo de fora. In addition to the distinction between Creoles, other elements were at play and make the need to generate cohesion and a sense of belonging and unity. The most visible of them was the racial one. The speaker, even though he has what we understand after the work of José Carlos Gomes dos Anjos and Eufemia Rocha, two really important anthropologists born in Cape Verde, traces of blackness in his body, he was easily read as white, and white within the Cape Verdean racial logic. It's different. Uh, Probably he would never, and he lives in Brazil, he would never be read as white in Brazil or in Portugal, but in Cape Verde he was. And in contrast to those women who were mostly black and very dark skinned. Still, he had lived in Brazil for a long time and had in his speech Brazilianized Creole, in addition to mannerism exogenous to that reality. Finally, the difference in class and education was tangible. While he had completed his higher education in another country, those women were either illiterate or with a low level of education. Despite all the difference at stake, Crioulo has served to generate cohesion and unity among those present, despite the disparities in the language spoken in the different localities of the island of Santiago itself. Another element is central to the scene, the way in which the enunciator is anchored in the synonym between the name of the language and the gentile used to indicate Cape Verdeans and their descendants. If everyone speaks some kind of Creole, in the end, they are all Creoles. That is, they are equal, they share a brotherhood under the auspices of the nation. However, the fact that someone speaks Cape Verdean Creole does not necessarily mark national belonging, even though this is one of the maximum symbols of the nation. And I'm almost moving to the next scene, but I let Rene go now.
Yeah, no, it's just this is so fascinating, and this is the kind of research I love ethnography, right? So like I love how language, how there's like actors that can modify their linguistic register, come from like a more privileged setting, and then they can create belonging when they need belonging, and then they can step back from it when they don't need it, and you still see those hierarchies. And something similar happens here, where we sometimes define our language as nashi, which means our language, when we need to strategically create belonging, but then we can fragment it by regional, national variety, what have it, when our interest is to create divisions, right? So it's interesting how flexible language really is. But so far we've spoken about using language to manage the internal dynamics. How is this language used to negotiate and create boundaries around who is outside of Cape Verde, the other that comes in?
And to answer your question, we go to the scene three. 3 years later, in 2022, I returned to Praia to carry out a new research for my PhD with women born in other West African countries such as Guinea-Bissau, Senegal, Gambia, Togo, Mali, Nigeria, and others, and who are living in the Cape Verdean capital. At that moment, I was looking for belonging, anti-blackness, and forms of solidarity uh, among them. soon as I arrived in the country, I started to see some dear friends again. And among them was Julia, a young woman born on the island of São Vicente who was living in Praia for a long time and who worked on cultural issues in Praia. When I shared my new research interests with her, her response was immediate. You need to meet this man who works here at Sucupira. Sucupira is this large bazaar where everything is sold and bought, marked by the presence of Cape Verdean women and men and women from other West African countries. And you can find food and fish and vegetables and clothes, everything, mobile phones, everything you can find in Sucupira. Even without knowing which country that man was from, she was sure that he was not from that she was sure that he was from another African country because he spoke a weird Creole. There we had a difference that delimited belonging. Just speaking Creole appeared to be not enough, but speaking in a weird way can put someone in a position of seniority to Cape Verdean society. In the end, Julia never introduced me to that man mentioned, but her phrase served to think how, even though everyone speaks Creole, not everyone can be a Creole. And why does this prohibition of Cape Verdeanity happen? Because even though language assumes a central place in the production of the self and the construction of affections in Cape Verde and its diaspora, the belonging demands a series of other elements. It will also encompass food, and this difference between Cape Verdeans and West African immigrants is always pointed out by Cape Verdeans, and they say, "Oh, West African immigrants have different cuisine from Cape Verdean," but you will always see Cape Verdean eating in Senegalese or Guinean restaurants in Sucupira. Also, on the body techniques, such as, for example, Cape Verdeans always build the difference between them and other West Africans with the act of eating, because especially people from Guinea-Bissau and Senegal, they used to eat with their hands with this really complex body technique. Or clothing, we can see the difference in clothing between this image and the previous ones I showed you with the PowerPoint presentation. The ancestral bond with the land, and above all, having not too dark, neither too light skin color. Because with my research was with African people from different countries, we can see also that if someone really with light skin and red as white is way white, that person will not be seen as a Cape Verdean. Side by side with these elements, the game of belonging will go through meticulous calculations that, from the collectivity, will define whether or not the act of speaking Creole will be enough to include that person as one of them. And especially for West African immigrants in Cape Verde, Cape Verdeans used to use this word that is manjaco, and manjaco in Cape Verde is understood as one, the name of the one of the largest ethnic groups in Guinea-Bissau, and in Cape Verde is used in a pejorative way, homogenizing the different populations from continental Africa who live in the country under the nickname of savages, illiterate, dirty, truly black, and other demerits. So you can be born in Guinea-Bissau, Senegal, Gambia, Nigeria, São Tomé, you probably will be called Manjaco. And we have this difference because this specificity because people from Guinea-Bissau also speaks Portuguese-based Creole, but they will be seen as Manjacos. And even if they have lighter skin, and we have this Creole elite in Guinea-Bissau, they will be called Manjaco or Branjaco. Branjaco came for the combination of branco, white, and manjaco, so they are seen as a whiter manjaco, but still a manjaco. so a foreigner. Do you wanna say something, Rene? I finished the the third scene.
Sorry. I was just so fascinated by this entire setting that so many things are going in my head. Um, so language is being used to negotiate the other, and there's all these hierarchies. And I was thinking about locality, right? And I was thinking, and this might be something you can address a little bit later. But I was also thinking that, we have a lot of people coming from outside to the Balkans lately. And it's hard for them to learn a language, but sometimes they do. And I wonder to what extent, because you showed us this situation where it's not only language, but it's what you look like, the geopolitical relationship of that country to Cape Verde, how you eat. There's all these like little aspects that come together to create belonging or otherness. So something that the contrast that I was thinking about is when we have a Western foreigner learning, one of our languages, then, even like two or three words are enough for a celebratory moment. But it's quite different when it comes to, temporary workers coming in. So that I was wondering, what about a Portuguese, the colonial power, when they come, who you aspire and like try to speak Creole? Is there still this boundary making on and how is it happening? But anyways,
That's an interesting question because almost never Portuguese tries to learn Cape Verdean Creole. And to be fair, also Brazilians almost never try to learn Cape Verdean Creole because of the proximities of the language. They are comfortable in different levels, so only go in Portuguese and not engaging really deep with Cape Verdean Creole. And we have some important reflections going with this. And after these three scenes are presented, which evidence the process of production of belonging and exclusion from the use of Creole, we can go to another path to more general understandings. Undoubtedly, Creole in Cape Verde is a language of social cohesion and comfort, everyday comfort, not only a material comfort. It's common that in large events, the official protocols are observed in Portuguese while everything else is discussed in Creole. The same happens in governmental spaces. On some month, the Cape Verdean Parliament discusses the state of the nation, a public session that is broadcasted live by national radio of Cape Verde and on their YouTube channel. As it is a governmental space, all the discussion is done in Portuguese. However, whenever the debate gets heated, it is common for the deputies to change the linguistic regime to Creole, especially those ones from PAICV, the African Party for the Independence of Cape Verde, linked to the anti-colonial struggle, which is currently in opposition to the government. This is done in order to publicly produce a performance of greater connection with Cape Verdean people and to show how different they are from people in the establishment, but they are also established. In this political game, it's also common to use a specific modality of Creole, its version in Portuguese. Portuguese, it's like black preto plus Portuguese, a black Portuguese. It consists in applying Portuguese words to a grammatical structure of Creole. This process of Portuguese Portuguesization of Creole is not restricted to Cape Verdean Parliament, but is common in other spaces in the country, especially when people from upper classes are there. For this reason, some linguists have pointed out that there is a process of decreolization underway. The decreolization has been happening in response to process of over-evaluation of Portuguese, the language that opens doors and provides possibilities for improving life in a context marked by scarcity and high circulation among Portuguese-speaking countries. Also, this is linked to the difficulty of finding consensus among the variants of Creole spoken in the country. However, even if this is a reality, I think it's too early and too binary to decree a full decreolization of Cape Verdean Creole. The first factor for this concerns precisely the need to overcome the binary view of identity formation in the country, which would swing between Africa with a special focus on the contributions of peoples from Guinea-Bissau, Senegal, and Gambia, and Europe. And when we are talking about Europe here, is Portugal. To think about this phenomenon in a broad and spiral way, as I have been doing since my master degree. The Fagosity character of Cape Verdean Creole is perhaps as alive as ever in recent years. In this process, the vocabulary of language is composed not only by words in grammatical compositions of Portuguese, Wolof, Mandinga, and etc., but also by the Africanized Spanish of Cuba, based on this historical post-independence relations between the two nations. Italian and English brought by migrants who left for the United States and Italy in recent years, and also the tourists who go to Cape Verde. And now we have this estimative that last year something like 1 million tourists arrived in Cabo Verde, compared with 500,000 people living in the country nowadays. Also, this Americanized Portuguese and what I and Americanized is different from Africanized because Americanized is an idea built by Lélia Gonzalez, this Brazilian scholar, that she used to understand the Brazilian Portuguese as an Africanized and indigenized Portuguese with these inspirations from African languages, especially Bantu speaker language and indigenous language we have and use in Brazil, especially through soap operas and music. And we have like three soap operas, three soap operas every day in Cape Verdean's main television broadcast. At least two of them are Brazilians, and we have a Brazilian channel working in Cabo Verde right now, RECAS, and that's another problem to talk about. And as well as the strong presence of immigrants that change the scenario of Cape Verdean city, especially West Africans and Chinese. And this Chinese diaspora in Cape Verde is really changing how the country behaves and builds the language. Because despite the most part of the European tourists and migrants in Cape Verde, the Chinese community tries to learn and speak the Cape Verdean Creole, but in a different way also. Maybe it is the Cape Verdean, it is in the Cape Verdean language, the Crioulo, where resides the main core of the Juntamon. Juntamon is this idea originated in Cape Verde that means put the hands together. This way of helping each other in times of adversity is not widespread, but selects the ones who seem to be more familiar than others. Creating social networks and boundaries who will belong to us and those who will be seen as outsiders. And who is the outsider who can become part of us? Because some of them can be part of the Cape Verdeanity. This way, before agreeing with the fatalist folk characteristics of the human sciences, like the idea of decreolization of Cape Verdean Creole, it may be interesting to observe the new social relations and power structures that are taking shape in the Cape Verdean islands. If, on the one hand, Cape Verdean Creole dictates who belongs and who does not belong to the nation, on the other hand, its consolidation as a national lingua franca and mother tongue. This shows how people are producing in their daily lives their language despite the colonial history and desires, not without tensions. Perhaps therein lies the beauty of social life, the complexity of showing hierarchies and their idiosyncrasies in everyday life beyond what seems black and white. The use of Cape Verdean Creole shows us that. I think for now is that. Thank you so much for being here today.
Vinicius, thank you so much for sharing, for trying to put together such complexity in 35 minutes. As an ethnographer myself, I know it's really overwhelming. You want to share everything. Just two things that really struck here was like telenovelas and what a great impact they have. And recently in at least in former Yugoslav countries, we Turkish telenovelas are really popular. So even though in some settings, Turkey is understood as this like old colonial power. We're still consuming the cultural production because it's relatable, right? And then also how language and Creole creates and shapes this belonging. And I find it really interesting that also like this change in geopolitical situations are having an influence, like Chinese merchants learning Creole and thus negotiating belonging. So I think but anyways, so I see that Dragana has shared her, raised her hand. But before that, I would also like to encourage you to ask for any clarification, any points that you would like to know more before we try to apply these lessons to our own context. But I'll let Dragana go first.
Oh, can you hear? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can.
Let me see even if the video is working. So, hi. Thank you so much. So basically, I understand that your site of research in this case is predominantly not in Europe, but because of the colonial history and the connection between Cape Verde and Portugal, I will ask one question about the Portugal, because I think it's always interesting to connect the dots, even in terms of migration, like the origin and destination. So while you presented, I tried to remember a book that I read during my PhD, and eventually I did. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her work. She was at University of Chicago, Kesha Fikes, Managing African Portugal, such a great book. So in that book, I learned so much, but what I remember as a fascinating point is that Portugal was also undertaking modernization because it was lagging behind other European countries. So in this context of late 80s, right, early 1990s, there were ladies, in this case, the study was about women from Cape Verde who were predominantly Black, and I'm not sure about the language that they spoke, were they fluent in Portuguese or not, but basically, during that time when Portugal was undertaking modernization, they were seen as a group undermining these modernization efforts in Portugal. Not only the fact that they're Black, but also the work that they were doing, because they were selling fish in the local market, and they wanted to clean those areas in Lisbon and to, like move everything to the supermarkets and big chains and everything that we have basically all over the place now. So those women stayed without that income because in a sense they were entrepreneurs, right? So they would become, I don't know, maybe housewives, etc., like she describes in the book and so on. But what is my question? Try to be brief. What is the position? What is the social position of people, not necessarily women, from Cape Verde in Portugal today, 30 years later, right? 35 years later. So if you can comment a little bit about that, it would be really interesting to hear. Thank you so much. Sorry if I was too long with the comment.
Can I go? Dragana, thank you so much for your question, because this is something I'm thinking to research in the future. I was in Lisbon for something like 6 months during my PhD, because we have this kind of an Erasmus scholarship, and I went there because I need to understand how the colonial power was structured by the former metropolis. So I engaged with several Cape Verdeans there, and it was better than being with my Brazilian fellows. I have to confess this. And I, especially Lisbon is a really racially segregated city. I used to live in this old and middle class neighborhood called Benfica. Benfica is the in that train line is the last white neighborhood in Lisbon. Everyone who stays in the metro or the train after Benfica is black. It's something really, really violent. And we have this really complex relation because Cape Verde was never under the indigenous laws during the Portuguese colonialism. What are the indigenous laws? Every Portuguese colony in African mainland have to answer as indigenous, but people from islands weren't understood as indigenous, so they have this special status legally. But I was researching in Portuguese archives and Cape Verdean archives and discovered that in the nowadays relations were Cape Verdeans are being treated as indigenous people. So we have some difference, of course, but most part of Cape Verdeans were treated almost the same as people from Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, and Angola. But Cape Verdeans still have this different status in the former Portuguese colonies. And for example, we have the Frontex provided by the European Union now, and Cape Verde is one of its signatories and receives money to keep people from other African countries in Cape Verde so they will not reach Europe. And was really common during my last research during my PhD. Some people from Guinea-Bissau or Senegal say, "Oh, borders in Cape Verde are harder than in Europe because they think they are the ones who will defend Europe from African invasion." And at the same time, Cape Verde receives a lot of money to keep those Black Africans into the country. They are receiving some facilities to Cape Verdeans go to Portugal and work there. Like when I was doing my field research in 2022, Portugal required specifically Cape Verdean bus drivers to go to Lisbon and Porto to work there. But if we think, okay, so Cape Verdeans are the luckiest into this racial system built for by the Portuguese colonialists. No, because when you go to Portugal, Cape Verdeans are the most violated by policy by the state. 30 years ago, I'm not sure if it was 1994 or 95. In Portugal they used to have this day we call Dia da Raça. It's like race day in the sense of the sense we are used to talking in sociology of race. And there was a Nazi rally in Lisbon, and these Portuguese guys were beating every single black person they see on the streets, and one of them who was murdered was a Cape Verdean guy with Cape Verdean ancestry, Alcindo Monteiro, and he was killed by those men. In the last years, almost every year we can see at least one new new case of a Cape Verdean being beaten or murdered by Portuguese policy. So we have this complex uh, relation that Cape Verdeans may have some facilities in Portugal, but the violence of Portuguese state is through them directly. So I think, and one interesting thing because my PhD research was how Cape Verdeans produce this type of anti-black racism against other Africans, despite the we have the skin color tonality is not that different, but we have this anti-black racism occurring there. And when we go to this African migrant community, African diaspora community in Portugal, the ones who are heading the anti-race movement are Cape Verdeans. And I think it's really interesting to think how complex all those relations are and how we can see everything black and white and like this. Did I answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. Plus, if I understand correctly, another layer is that Cape Verdeans have Portuguese citizenship. So that's
Yeah.
like like another layer of, like complexity and analysis, that even the notion of citizenship doesn't mean that you are understood, or that you even understand yourself as a member of like that community. So
Yes,
thank you. Yes.
I'm going to talk more because this topic really makes me. Cape Verdeans could request Portuguese citizenship, but it's really interesting in a anthropological way, obviously, how they are second-class citizens. And I say this because in Portugal, in far-right forums, it's really common to call Cape Verdeans with Portuguese citizenship Portugueses. And despite how we treated Portuguese as a different kind of Creole, here we are thinking a black Portuguese, so he's not Portuguese at all. And it's really fascinating because one day I was on vacation in Brazil, and I was with those friends and some friends of my friends, and one of them was all of them Brazilians, and one of them said, "Oh, my grandma was a daughter of Portuguese, and I'm trying to request Portuguese citizenship." And one of her friends asked, "But they were Portuguese from Portugal or Cabo Verde?" So how hierarchical this relation is, and how almost never, although Cape Verde was, I may be wrong, but I don't think so. Cape Verde was the only former colony who had congressman in Portuguese Congress during the colonial times, but he was as white as all the other Portuguese. So that's it.
Dragana, thank you so much for your questions, and Vinicius, thank you for taking us this really interesting tangent. Which what I think it shows is that we can't think of any of these processes in isolation. And just because I like to think of the world in terms of maps, when you mentioned Frontex, I couldn't but notice the fact that Cape Verde is the western edge of Frontex, and then you have Croatia, which is the eastern edge of Frontex, and we also have this negotiation, this like macro European process in keeping and using the margins, the periphery, in order to affect belong and everything. And another thing when speaking about citizenship, and I think this is something that maybe Bosnian people with Croatian citizenship also experience, they find themselves on the other side of Frontex and are always used as to reinforce this fortress Europe while becoming second-class citizens once they come to Croatia. Of course, there is not this layer of racialization is also overlaid, but there is definitely a linguistic component to it. So I like connecting the dots on these two different edges. I see that we have another hand from Yulia. Do you have anything to say to wrap up this comment, or can we go ahead to Yulia's question?
Just quickly, one really interesting thing during COVID pandemics was the Portuguese government produced advertisement in Crioulo, but not only to Cape Verdeans, but also people from Guinea-Bissau. And some far-right Portuguese people were like, "It's outrageous that we are using this black determined former Portuguese in our country. If they are here, they have to speak Portuguese, but no one says that about the thousands of new European people living there as digital nomads because they can speak English.
Yeah. And same with
Sorry.
expats. You know, there's people who've been living in Zagreb for 10 years, don't speak a word of Croatian, but you know, the Filipina that sells your bread, she gets reprimanded for not speaking Croatian. Let's go to Julia.
Hi, thank you to both of you. Sorry, let me just try to turn. Hi. So thank you to both of you. It was really interesting. So I have kind of a delicate question. So, so my background is from philosophy of language, right? And more specifically, I deal with slurs. So, of course, when I listen to your presentation about language and so on, I wanted to ask you, are there any specific slurs in Cape Verde that you would maybe, I don't know, like slurs for Portuguese or something that is something that's kind of interesting for me to hear.
Thank you, Julia. I pronounced your name correctly. I hope so.
Julia, yeah, it's Julia.
Julia,
Mhm.
thank you. It's not exactly a slur
Mhm.
because Cape Verdeans used to call Portuguese Tuga. That's a short form for Portuguese.
Okay.
But it depends on how you pronounce it. It can be or not be a slur. And we have a complexity here because Cape Verdeans who live in Lisbon or were born Lisbon in Portugal at all or were born there, they are also called Tuga. The same for the ones who are living or were born in Italy, they are called Italianos and those things. And that's interesting because when we take the PhD research of my supervisor André Lobo, he did research in Boa Vista, and Boa Vista is the only island in Cabo Verde who had more women immigration than men. And there's this really complex relation between who left and who stayed that if someone arrives there and for example and women from Boa Vista go to Italy, most part of them are going to Italy and work there, and when they come back they start, oh, I forgot how to say this in Crioulo, I'm only remember reading in Italian. They're like, oh, that Italiana thinks she's better than us. So it depends more on the with the data I have. Obviously we can have other things, but when and I saw this lots of times when Cape Verde wants to be offensive with a white person, they they are going to add de merda, like shit, in the front. So they will say tuga de merda or branco de merda, and this is obviously offensive.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So just a quick follow-up. So when you said that the differences in pronunciation, do you mean just the actual pronunciation or the context? So for example, you add something, for example, di merde, or is it just a pronunciation? So
And both of them, the
okay.
pronunciation and the context.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you.
I'm the one. Thank you for the question.
It's fascinating how migration then brings a trace back to the islands, and how Taliana also becomes a slur, and sort of like that boundary keeping of the migrant and everything. Does anybody else have a question or a comment about how the way in which we can apply these complex dynamics to your own context? Awkward silence. Well, no questions for now, but I'm not letting you go yet because I think we have to unpack this because I think migration is such a core topic, which I think we already saw how it complicates the relationship, the power dynamics, especially with planes and everything. Could you tell us a little bit more about these migration flows? And how they affect identity building and belonging. You just mentioned this very gendered type of migration to Italy. If I don't know if
I think thinking about this is the main question of Cape Verdeans is how, because we have more Cape Verdeans and their descendants outside Cape Verde than in the country. So it shapes daily lives because Cape Verde doesn't have a strong industry in the country. So almost everything comes from outside, and it's really important, for example, that the relatives who are in other countries send things to the ones who stayed, and how they are consuming this. When I did my research for my bachelor, I was looking to those women selling stuff they bought in different countries, but also they received those stuffs from their relatives. One of them, for example, she used to receive this these huge boxes with perfumed clothes, cell phones from their by their mom who was living in United States, and how all her store was presented to people as, oh, now we have American products, and how this is part of my self building, but also how people are going to not only those stuff, but also how they are building the houses. The house will have elements from the countries where the relatives are living, and how most part of the Cape Verdeans, not all of them, are building houses in the country for when they retire and can come back to the homeland. So each part of the Cape Verdean life is transpassed by its diaspora. You, I had this scene. I never wrote about this. I was applying some formulas with the migrant community was living in Cape Verde, trying to understand how the COVID pandemics affected their lives. And I was doing this with this Cape Verdean friend. He, and we used to have a really great relation, and we had to stop to look for something in his bag, and he took off his passport. And I was like, why are you a Cape Verdean with a passport? And I'm a, I'm a foreigner here, and my passport is in my house. I'm only with my Brazilian ID. I don't carry my passport. I was like, no, but we never know when I had to flew away. And I'm like, how you are going to go to another country? And, and actually, it happened to him. One day he called me, oh, my mom bought me a ticket and I'm going to Lisbon next week. So that's how, and this is the main aspect of migration in Cape Verde, but we also have people coming to Cape Verde and changing the landscapes and how people are dealing every day, because we have people from West Africa, we have the Chinese diaspora, we have Europeans, especially in those main islands that live for the tourism, especially Sao and Boa Vista, and how those people are not living with themselves, but also marrying Cape Verdeans and changing internal family dynamics. So it's everywhere.
Vinicius, thank you for this. Like, I can, like every time you speak, like every once in a while, it feels like you're describing some aspects of Croatian realities, and I find that mind-boggling because right next to my sister's house here close to Rijeka, there's an entire street where retirees from Germany came and built these huge mansions with these like aspects that don't belong to Mediterranean, setting. And you see how we are also, at least I can speak about Croatia, a country that lives in two places simultaneously. And there's this constant migration influence because we're always looking on that side, right? And there's even this expression vani, which means outside, which means the West. Now, if anybody else doesn't have question, we're running on time. I would like to give you an opportunity if you would like to, and this is another similarity, at least when it comes to Croatia, of having a country where tourism is a humongous part of not only its identity, but like its economic sustenance system. And I know that you wrote your master's on that in your book. So like, if anybody else doesn't have any questions, and I'm just taking a look, no hands if you want to maybe wrap up telling us a little bit about the role of tourism.
Okay, as Cape Verdean diaspora represents 20% of Cape Verdean's income, and the same is for the tourism. The tourism represents 20% of Cape Verdean's income today, and but we have this concentration on two islands, Sal and Boa Vista. And Boa Vista receives something like 80% of Cape Verdean's tourism. And we have something important because more money is going on the country, but also who's getting wealthier with tourism. Because if you look who owns the hotels and the car renting places are always people from Western Europe, especially Italians and English people from England. Portuguese are not they are most prominent in Praia, but in the last 10, 15 years more or less we could saw this huge movement in Cape Verde from uh, poor women trying to create this authentic Cape Verdean handcraft for souvenirs so they can be part of the tourism industry and want something with this because we have all of this and also Cape Verde is one of the biggest sexual tourism places on earth and we had this news by the end of 2025 especially white women going to Cape Verde to have sex with Cape Verdean men. And not only this, we have child abuse occurring through this, and so it's a really sensitive question. I don't think Cape Verdean authorities are looking at this as they should because they are getting money with this. But yeah, tourism is changing everyone's life as its diaspora uh, does. Have I answered your
Oh no,
question?
you have, and I think you've just set up many more talks between us. And I think I hope other participants will also reach out to some comparative work and see how these global processes of tourism, of diaspora, of frontier keeping are not isolated to any of our contexts. So I really hope this has motivated some more solidarities, right? Maybe for a while avoiding the Western Europe as a mediator, right? And just like have these conversation between the global East and global South, for lack of better words. Do we have any question? We have Dragan Amirbush congratulating your work, and I congratulate you too. And I hope I'm looking forward to reading many more books Do we have any question before we go eat? Oh, we do. Sirjan.
Yeah, hello there. I'm sorry for coming to very last minute, but you just triggered my mind with something that might be close to my heart when it comes. I have zero knowledge about the language and the identity and the migrations. I mean, I just worked to HIV many years ago, but what strikes me the most here is like I would like to ask you, like, have you considered the context of the vulnerability itself through your work, like is coming to identity of the community or a migration, or like how the vulnerability of one community impacts the other one and shapes the, like the context of living one community in that particular place. I just love the vulnerability as identity as itself. So that's my question. And maybe it's also related to stigma and discrimination, as you mentioned earlier, when it comes to the language and the recognizing the communities and the interaction between. So sorry for jumping the last minute, but yeah, it could be very nice to hear from that, as you have a great, you had a really great the presentation. I congratulate both of you for that, and it's very interesting for me.
Thank you so much. I totally agree with you. I think vulnerability is a central topic in Cape Verdean daily lives, because I was really quick on this during the first part of my presentation, saying how Cape Verde is a really dry country. And when I'm saying really dry country, they can survive for 3, 4, 5 years without no rain. And how this shaped Cape Verdean personality in a bigger sense. And not only this, but how Portuguese empire created famines so they can explore Cape Verdean labor. And how all of this, not only this, but another important thing about vulnerability, knowing how the Cape Verdean islands were so dry and was hard to grow food and create animals there, how the Portuguese used to, as Ribeira Grande de Santiago was the last port in the Middle Atlantic, how many times when they have some any enslaved person in the ship giving problem to them, they just throw the person there so the person would die in the island without help. And how all of this created this sense of belonging to the land and community in reason of the vulnerability. How thousands of Cape Verdeans died by famine because the Portuguese didn't gave them food enough so they can survive. And I finished saying about the Juntamon. The Juntamon is exactly how the Cape Verdeans surpass the difficulties and the vulnerability of daily life, because Juntamon is this act of being together and help each other with uh, with the farm labor or building the house, or if I have corn, or if I'm going to kill a pig, I will share with my neighbors, because we are a community and we have to care for each other. And this is really strong in Cape Verdean identity and daily life.
And yet it seems that, being together and sharing, it also has its limits.
Yeah.
It's also, how do we decide who is the one that gets, a plate at the dinner party, and who doesn't, and how that's established. Well, Vinicius, thank you so, so much for your contribution. I hope this was as enjoyable to others as it has been to me, and I hope it was interesting for you to share your presentation, and we welcome you to come visit us anytime. I think I can speak in the name of everyone here. Come, but come in the summer. So we can observe the tourism, of course, and all for not to Not to just swim and have like an Aperol spritz. Okay, I'll give the word to Tina to close up. Thank you. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Thank you very much for everyone, to everyone. And have a nice rest of the day. Thank you, Vinícius. See you. Bye bye.
Thank you.